This case seemed solved within days. 5 teenagers confessed. But years later, the truth told a completely different story. They confessed, but were they guilty? In 1989, in New York City, a crime shocked the public. A young woman was attacked in Central Park. The story spread fast, and so did the pressure to find who was responsible. Within days, 5 teenagers were arrested. They confessed. The case seemed closed, but something didn't feel right, because the truth did not match the story that was told. This is not only the story of a crime, it is the story of how a case was built, how statements were taken, how pressure can shape outcomes, and what happens when the need for answers becomes stronger than the need for truth. Because sometimes, the most important question is not who committed the crime, but how the system decided who did. On April 19, 1989, Central Park did not feel like a place of calm. As the sun went down, the atmosphere began to change. What was usually a space for quiet walks and evening runs slowly turned into something more unpredictable. Groups of teenagers moved through the park, some running, some shouting, some looking for attention or something else. Later, it would be described with a single word: wilding, a term that would come to define the night. But at the time, it was simply confusion, movement without direction, energy without control. There were reports of harassment, people being chased, small groups surrounding strangers, incidents that, on their own, might not have seemed connected. But together, they painted a picture of something building beneath the surface. And then, at the same time, in another part of the park, a woman was running alone. Her name was Trisha May Lee. She had done this before. The same park, the same kind of evening. It was routine, familiar, controlled, until it wasn't. Sometime between 9 and 10 p.m., that routine was interrupted. She was attacked, beaten severely, assaulted, left in the dark, far from the paths people usually took. No one saw what happened. No one heard enough to stop it. And for hours, no one found her. When she was finally discovered, it was almost by accident. Her condition was critical: severe head injuries, blood loss. She could not speak. She could not explain. She could not remember. At that moment, there were no answers, only a crime scene, and a question that no one could yet understand. Because what happened that night was only the beginning of a much larger story. By the morning of April 20th, the story had already begun to take shape, not through evidence, but through headlines. The attack in Central Park quickly became front-page news. A young woman found barely alive in one of the most well-known parks in the world. The details were limited, but the impact was immediate. This was not just another crime. It felt like something bigger. New York in the late 1980s was already a city on edge. Crime rates were high, public trust was fragile, and many believed the city was losing control of its own streets. This case seemed to confirm those fears. The media coverage intensified. Words like brutal, savage, and random were repeated again and again. The victim was described as an innocent runner. The park as a place no longer safe. And slowly, a narrative began to form, not based on what was fully known, but on what people feared. There was pressure on the police to act quickly, to find answers, to show that the situation was under control. Every hour without a suspect added to the tension. The public wanted reassurance, the city wanted resolution, and the system began to move faster. But speed comes with a cost, because when the need for answers becomes urgent, the line between finding the truth and creating a version of it can start to blur. And in this case, that line would matter more than anyone realized. As the investigation moved forward, the focus began to shift, not toward a single suspect, but toward a group. On the night of April 19th, police had already encountered multiple teenagers inside Central Park. Some were stopped, some were brought in for questioning. At first, it was related to reports of disturbances, harassment, minor assaults, incidents that had taken place across different areas of the park. It did not seem like one coordinated event, but as the hours passed, those separate incidents started to be viewed differently, as part of something larger. Among those brought in were 5 teenagers: Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise. They were between the ages of 14 and 16. At that point, there was no clear physical evidence linking them to the attack on the jogger, no DNA match, no direct identification, no confirmed timeline placing them at the exact scene. But they had been in the park, and that increasingly began to matter. What started as questioning about general disturbances slowly turned into something else, a search for connections. Investigators began trying to piece together a sequence of events. Who was where? Who saw what? Who might have been involved? And in that process, the same names continued to appear, not because of what had been proven, but because of proximity, because of presence, because of possibility. And as the pressure to solve the case continued to grow, those possibilities began to solidify into suspects, into a narrative, and eventually into a direction the investigation would follow. A direction that, from that point on, would become harder and harder to question. What happened next did not take place in the park. It happened in rooms, small, closed, controlled. After being brought in, the teenagers were questioned for hours, not all at once, not together, but one by one in separate spaces with different investigators at different times of the night. Some had been there since the evening, and the questioning continued into the early hours of the morning. They were young, tired, and increasingly disoriented. In some cases, they were questioned without a lawyer present. In others, without a parent in the room for long periods of time. The lines between conversation, pressure, and direction began to blur. The goal was to understand what had happened, but the methods mattered. Questions were repeated, details were suggested, timelines were adjusted, and slowly, the statements began to change. Each teenager described parts of the night differently. Some accounts overlapped, others contradicted each other. Certain details did not match the physical evidence, and yet over time, a version of events started to form, not identical, but similar enough to suggest involvement. Eventually, several of them gave recorded statements, confessions. On video, they described the attack, their roles, what they claimed had happened that night. But even in those recordings, there were inconsistencies, details that did not align, facts that did not fit, and pieces that seemed to come not from memory, but from somewhere else. Because when a person is questioned for long enough, under enough pressure, the difference between what is remembered and what is accepted can become unclear. And in this case, those statements would become the foundation of everything that followed. Some of the details didn't match, the timelines were inconsistent, and the evidence told a different story. But the case was already moving forward. By the time the recordings were complete, the case appeared to have its answer. 5 teenagers, 5 confessions. On the surface, it seemed clear. They had described the attack. They had placed themselves in the park. They had admitted involvement. For many, that was enough. But when those statements were examined more closely, they did not tell a single story. They told several. Each version of events was different. The sequence of actions changed from one account to another. Who did what and when was not consistent. Some described holding the victim, others described striking her. But the details shifted depending on who was speaking. There was no unified timeline, no clear sequence, only fragments that partially overlapped. And then there was the physical evidence. DNA recovered from the victim did not match any of the 5 teenagers, not one. There were also discrepancies about the location of the attack, the nature of the injuries, and key details that someone directly involved would be expected to know. Yet, despite these contradictions, the confessions remained central. They were presented as the core of the case, not as pieces to be questioned, but as answers to be accepted. The narrative had already taken shape, and now it was being reinforced, repeated, confirmed through repetition rather than verification, because once a confession exists, it changes how everything else is seen. Evidence is interpreted differently, doubts become secondary, and inconsistencies are often explained away. In this case, the confessions did not resolve the contradictions. They existed alongside them, and still the case moved forward. When the case reached the courtroom, the story was already familiar. 5 teenagers, a brutal attack, and confessions that seemed to explain what had happened. For the prosecution, the foundation was clear. The statements given during interrogation were presented as evidence. Video recordings were shown. Each confession, despite its differences, was used to support a single conclusion that the defendants had acted together. But outside of those statements, the case was less certain. There was no DNA linking the teenagers to the crime, no physical evidence placing them directly at the scene of the attack, no eyewitness who could identify them with certainty. The defense focused on these gaps. They pointed to the inconsistencies in the confessions, the contradictions between accounts, the lack of alignment with forensic findings, and the conditions under which the statements had been obtained. Long hours, no legal guidance in critical moments, young suspects under pressure, but in a courtroom, evidence is not only what exists, it is also how it is perceived. And by then, the perception of the case had already been shaped. The media coverage, the public reaction, the need for resolution. All of it had created a narrative that was difficult to step outside of. Because once a story is widely accepted, questioning it can feel like denying the truth. And in this trial, that tension was constant between what was presented and what could actually be proven, between what people believed and what could be confirmed. And as the proceedings continued, those two things did not always align, but the case was moving forward and a decision was getting closer. When the verdict was announced, it brought a sense of closure, at least on the surface. The jury found the teenagers guilty, not all on the same charges, not all to the same degree. But together, the outcome was clear. The court had accepted the narrative that had been built. The confessions had held, and with them, the case. Sentences were given, years of imprisonment stretching into what, for them, would become the defining period of their lives. They were still teenagers, but now they were convicted. For the public, The decision answered a question that had been hanging over the city since that night. Who did this? And now there was an answer. The case, for many, was over, filed away as solved, understood, resolved. But resolution does not always mean truth, because even as the verdict was accepted, the same questions remained: the inconsistencies, the missing evidence, the parts of the story that never fully aligned. They did not disappear. They were simply no longer the focus. And as time moved forward, those details stayed in the background, unanswered, waiting. More than a decade passed. The case had long been considered closed. The convictions had been served. The story, for most people, was no longer questioned. But in 2002, something changed. A man named Matias Reyes came forward. He was already in prison, serving a life sentence for other violent crimes. And what he said did not fit the version of events that had been accepted for years. He confessed to the attack in Central Park, not as part of a group, but alone. At first, it was just another statement, another claim, something that needed to be examined carefully. Because in a case like this, words alone were not enough. But this time, there was more. Reyes provided details that had not been publicly released, specific elements of the crime that only someone directly involved would be expected to know. Investigators compared his account with the original evidence, and then they tested the DNA. It matched. For the first time, there was a direct physical connection to a single individual, not five. One. The implications were immediate. If Reyes had acted alone, then the original case did not just contain errors, it was fundamentally wrong. The confessions no longer fit. The timeline no longer worked. The entire structure of the case began to collapse. What had once seemed certain now raised a different question. Not who committed the crime, but how the wrong answer had been accepted for so long. After the new evidence came to light, the case could no longer remain as it was. The confession from Matias Reyes, supported by DNA, forced a re-examination of everything that had been accepted years earlier. Investigators reviewed the original files, the statements, the timelines, the evidence that had once been used to secure convictions. And this time, the conclusions were different. In 2002, the convictions of the 5 men were officially vacated. The charges were dismissed. Their records were cleared. Legally, they were no longer guilty. They were exonerated. But exoneration does not erase time. By then, they had spent years in prison, years that could not be returned, years shaped by a decision that in the end was proven to be wrong. When they walked free, the case that had once defined them was no longer the same. The story had changed, the narrative had shifted, but the impact remained, because being cleared is not the same as never being accused, and being released is not the same as getting those years back. The system had corrected itself, but only after it had failed, and for those at the center of the case, that distinction mattered. After the convictions were overturned, the case returned to public attention. But this time, the questions were different. Not about what had happened in the park, but about what had happened in the investigation. The 5 men filed a lawsuit against the city of New York. They argued that their rights had been violated, that the process that led to their convictions had been flawed from the beginning. For years, the case moved through the legal system once again. And once again, opinions were divided. Some saw the exoneration as proof of a serious failure. Others questioned how such a mistake could have been made at all. The discussions extended beyond the individuals involved into larger concerns about policing, prosecution, and the role of public pressure. In 2014, a settlement was reached. The city agreed to pay millions of dollars in compensation. It was an acknowledgement, but not a complete resolution. Because cases like this do not end in a single moment. They continue in public memory, in legal discussions, in the way future investigations are conducted. The Central Park case became part of a larger conversation about false confessions, about the vulnerability of young suspects, about how quickly a narrative can take hold and how difficult it can be to change once it does. And even years later, the same question remained. Not just how it happened, but whether it could happen again. The Central Park case is often remembered for what went wrong. 5 teenagers arrested, 5 confessions, years lost, and a truth that arrived too late. But this story was never only about one case. It was about a process, a system under pressure, a moment when the need for answers became stronger than the need for certainty. Because nothing in this case happened in isolation. The fear in the city, the headlines, the urgency to restore order, all of it shaped the way the investigation moved forward. And in that environment, doubt became secondary, questions became obstacles, and a narrative, once formed, became difficult to challenge, even when the details did not fully align, even when the evidence was incomplete, even when something did not feel right, because sometimes a case is not solved when the truth is found, but when an answer is accepted. And once that happens, everything that follows begins to fit that answer, whether it should or not. The Central Park case was eventually corrected, but only after years had passed, and by then, the damage had already been done, which leaves a final question, not only about this case, but about any case that follows. When the pressure is high and the need for answers is immediate, how does a system decide what to believe? The Central Park case was eventually corrected, but only after years had passed, and by then, the damage had already been done. Because this story was never only about 5 teenagers. It was about how easily a narrative can become the truth when people need answers more than they need accuracy. And once that happens, questioning that truth becomes harder than accepting it. Next on True Echoes. The previous case raised questions about the system, about how decisions are made, and what happens when the truth is missed. But sometimes, the question is not about the system. It's about something much closer. In 2023, in Ohio, a father made a decision that would shock the country. 3 children, 1 home, and an act that no one expected. This time, there are no missing pieces, no unclear timeline, only one question. What leads someone to do this? Next on True Echoes, the Chad Doerman case. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. What do you think? Was this a failure of individuals or of the system itself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because stories don't end, they echo. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.